Welcome to Crossroads. Cracker Barrel. It's become the latest focus in the culture wars, but it's actually not just about Cracker Barrel. The issue is bringing attention to the broader trend of corporate rebranding, sucking the life out of institutions and making them cold, empty, and very hollow feeling. Is it actually better for us? Is the nostalgic look better? Let's talk about it. Also, in other news, President Donald Trump issued a direct threat to billionaire George Soros. Pretty big development. And also to his son. And Trump is suggesting they should face RICO charges. Huge update on that. We'll get into it. And also in other news, Antifa is becoming more extreme. Go figure. And it's also now splintering into even more violent offshoots, including radical trans activists talking about shooting people. We'll be discussing these topics and a lot more today, so don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Now look, first off, good old Cracker Barrel. Well, there's been a lot of news about the old-timey style restaurant after it announced a not so old-timey design, let's say. They changed the logo, they made this like hollowed out corporate facility looking thing, and people criticized it for stripping away its character and the old-fashioned family values. The company did something interesting. They decided to roll back to the old logo. This was because of the huge pushback, but also because their stock just crashed and now it's actually rebounding. Now, the issue has brought attention to broader trends of corporate rebrandings, raising the question, I think, which is interesting, is the nostalgic look better? Why does it matter? Why do we care so much? Now, first off, on the recent rollback of the redesign, this is the announcement for the company stating it's going to scrap the whole idea for the brand new logo. This is their official announcement. They say this, quote, "We thank our guests for sharing your voices and love for Cracker Barrel. We said we would listen, and we have. Our new logo is going away." Going away. And they say our old timer will remain. Because, you know, the logo, the old one, is the old man and the barrel. Some would say the cracker and the barrel, right? And of course, you know, the old time kind of logo that's not as clean exactly. Now, anybody who's been inside Cracker Barrel knows it's like old time kitchen, kind of family, you know, sitting in the living room type vibe, kind of like, feels like you're kind of in the 1970s still. But people like it. We like going there with our families. We like getting, the breakfast is very good in my opinion. And, you know, there's something about it, right? Now, the backlash, I would say, was not just about Cracker Barrel, though. I would actually say that the backlash against this was part of a broader trend. People are not just mad about Cracker Barrel. People are mad about the rebranding of basically every nostalgic brand we have. Stripping away the character, stripping away the kind of warm environment, and changing it to something that just feels cold and empty. It was about the broader rebrandings we've been watching over many years. I mean, even in my lifetime, I've seen a lot of this. They were being accused of basically just pulling the character out of these places. Now, look, let me show you a few of these, right? McDonald's. Does anybody remember what McDonald's used to look like? And how it looks now, frankly. McDonald's, they went from the very family-friendly spot. You might remember there's all the cartoon characters and the Hamburglar and all that. They had the big play places for kids. You'd go there. Parents could just hang out for a little bit. The kids would go play in the play place. It was a family-friendly restaurant. There wasn't a crackhead in the corner or a guy doing fentanyl in the bathroom, like the ones in New York are like. It went from that to being this ultra-modern, simplified environment. Now, you could say the new design, it's like more sleek, right? It looks more like a New York City cafe, but it's being accused of losing its character, of losing its warmth, and losing kind of that kind of family-friendly vibe to it. What about Pizza Hut? Who remembers what Pizza Hut used to look like? They've gone down the same exact route with the whole modernist, minimalist design. Those who remember know. Pizza Hut used to have a really warm vibe to it. They had the old building with like the slanted roof, the great pizza buffet. Who remembers the pizza buffet? And the very warm interior, the checkered pattern placemats and everything else. It was an experience. You went there, you could feel like you could hang out, and it had a real nostalgic, very Americana type vibe. You felt, hey, this is it felt like it was something you could relate to on a cultural level. Same thing with Taco Bell. Now, the ones some of us remember as kids were designed very similar to the old Spanish missions. I might sound old saying this. They used to have character, right? They used to have like the bell and the, everything else, kind of the old Adobe quite look to it, right? And just like the rest, what happened to Taco Bell? They stripped it of its character. They pulled the heart out of it, right? And they replaced it with this cold, simplified, modernist design. Now, is this a good thing? I think it's very interesting that Cracker Barrel was going to go that way and they stopped. The change was not just to the logo, the change was to the entire facility. And you could argue the new design that they were moving towards, actually it was closer to what all their competitors did. From a corporate standpoint, it made sense. From a corporate standpoint, it would have made perfect sense, right? And maybe there's some kind of deeper draw, I'd say, though, to that more classic style, that more warm, family-friendly style. The backlash from the public that forced Cracker Barrel, looking at its stocks, to change this, and the rebound we've watched on its stock since doing this, might actually be kind of a turning point culturally. I'm going on a limb here. This might encourage other corporate brands to say, you know what? Maybe we're doing it all wrong. Maybe it's time to go back, right? Maybe it's time to bring back the old slanted roof at Pizza Hut or the bell at Taco Bell. Maybe McDonald's needs the old play places again. We will see if they end up doing it, but it is interesting. Cracker Barrel went to the edge of the abyss, looked down, and then turned back. And people are very happy about it, actually. Now, I would ask a couple questions, though. Some people say this is part of the, quote-unquote, wokening of America. Not waking up, but woking up. Meaning, of course, we're eliminating the character, the culture, the values we used to represent. And look, to our European friends out there, or Canadian friends, you might be like, Josh, what the heck are you talking about? Look, you don't mess with America's fast food. That's what I'm talking about. Americans have like an emotional connection to fast food restaurants. I'm not joking, right? Because it's nostalgic for us. We grew up going to these places. They're kind of part of, the culture that we raised in. For me, it was going to these places with my friends, sometimes, lunchtime, sometimes late at night, hanging out. We remember these places on road trips. There's something about kind of Americana and, the life on the road. Americans, of course, probably drive a lot more than people in most countries. We have a very road-heavy lifestyle. And the truck stops and the tourist traps, and especially the fast food places on the road, these really do hold kind of a part of our culture. When we see them get stripped of the character that has that American feel to it and go to these more modernist corporate vibes, it sounds funny, but I feel like there's almost a loss we feel to it, that something from our childhood is being taken away, and that, going forward to our own kids, they're not going to have that. And I'd say that actually is what it comes down to, I think. It feels like the family values are being pulled out of these institutions when they do these very just sanitized rebrandings. The average American feels that they're being pushed aside with this. And I think it's because of this that the whole culture war narrative, really does reflect heavily in this corporate rebranding. I would say maybe this is a sign we're at a turning point, though. Maybe the fact that maybe the Cracker Barrel moment is the true turning point of the United States. The looking down to the abyss and the turning back and going back to tradition. Well, we can only hope, right? Now, look, in other news, though, President Donald Trump issued a direct threat to billionaire George Soros and to his son. This is a very, very big deal because George Soros, he's kind of handing off his empire to his son. And George Soros is, of course, the big money man behind many of the Democrat, but more so the grassroots type things. And what they're being accused of by Trump, not by the Justice Department, by Trump himself, they're being accused of basically being the facilitators of these organizations that incite riots, that get engaged in attacking ICE agents and everything else, organizing protests, these waves of anti-American fury that we've been watching across the country for at least the last 10 years. Donald Trump is suggesting they should face RICO charges for this. Let me show you first what Trump is saying. He said this on Truth Social. He said, George Soros and his wonderful radical left son should be charged with RICO because of their support of violent protests and much more, all throughout the United States of America. He said, we're not going to allow these lunatics to rip apart America anymore, never giving it so much as a chance to breathe and be free. He said Soros and his group of psychopaths have caused great damage to our country. That includes his crazy West Coast friends. He said, be careful, we're watching you. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Pretty heavy statements from the President of the United States. Be careful, we're watching you. And a direct warning to kind of the big money men behind many of the grassroots movements we see on the far left. This is a big deal, actually, because you could argue that if you give money to, let's say a nonprofit organization, an NGO, and the NGO then gives money to a third-party organization, another one, and that organization incites riots, maybe starts protests, but they turn violent. Is the person who gave the money in the first place responsible for the actions of this institution? I mean, that's a fair question to ask, right? And is everybody in between also guilty if these crazy people start a riot? What Trump is suggesting, though, is that maybe this is part of the plan. This is part of the bigger picture. RICO charges, right? Suggesting that this is, basically the collaboration in a scheme with the intent of causing civil unrest. Now, on George Soros' side, I think he'd argue, we're just fighting for equality. We're fighting for, racial equity. I think the narrative is more equity than it is equality. We're fighting for the open societies of the world, right? They have the Open Societies Foundation. And he would argue, and I think many Democrats would argue, that he does represent more of kind of a Democrat agenda type vision for the United States, being fair, right? But we've also seen that the money he gives does tend to fall into the hands of kind of the people organizing the mass protests all across the United States. A lot of it is not direct. A lot of it, again, they give it to one organization. That organization distributes it to other organizations. Sometimes you have tons of them. Sometimes they even start up based on individual movements. For example, during Black Lives Matter, a lot of it went to black radical movements. During the whole anti-ICE protests, they started new third-party organizations, and those were more focused on Latino, advocacy and such like that. They tend to start new movements up based on the political narratives. Couple other points on Soros. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party, in their own writing, they call him a financial terrorist. They note that he got rich by crashing the economies of many countries, including, by the way, the United Kingdom, a couple times, in fact. It's a long story, but he basically has used his influence to crash economies, and then he buys he buys when it's down, basically. That's how he made a lot of his money. He also was brought to China and actually trained the Chinese Communist Party on how to wage financial warfare. So a lot of the Chinese Communist Party's systems of financial warfare were actually informed by Soros. While the Chinese Communist Party regards him as a financial terrorist, their words, not mine, that's what they say, in the eyes of the CCP, it's something they want to do as well. They want to master the art of financial terrorism. And so, of course, they've worked with him on that, learning how to do it. For George Soros' part, though, he has sometimes been critical of the CCP. He's not like one side or the other with it. I have seen him make pretty strong statements against the Chinese Communist Party despite that. But again, that's the issue. The other issue is how you can puppeteer different tiers of power. Some have framed the strategy of, let's say, influencing the grassroots as being part of a broader scheme when you can influence DAs, like if you back the political campaigns of district's attorney, if you back the political campaigns of elected officials, and if you back different news outlets. If you can control let's say the politicians to an extent, only one or two, right? You've given money to their campaigns, you have some influence over them because they need you for their donations, right? that means you control political action to an extent. Or at least you can advocate them and say, please react to this. If you control the media, it means you can control the narratives framed on the grassroots and the political side. And if you, in addition to that, control the grassroots, the protest organizations, what does that mean? It means you can incite political narratives. You can create movements. And so what do if you puppeteer all three of these? Or not even puppeteer, just have some influence over all three tiers of these. This is the strategy of a color revolution. This is how you overthrow a country through subversion, one of the methods. And this is one of the things that I believe he's being accused of right now, because he does have these three tiers of influence. What you do is you start a protest. You fund it, you organize it, you pay for it. Maybe there's an existing movement and you just pour money into it so they can expand. They hold the protest. They hold a big movement advocating against one set political issue, which is the issue that you want to push. Maybe it's that you want to have more district's attorney who represent your race narratives, right? Which is one of the big things they've worked on. Then what do? You have the media you're funding or influencing react to it. Soros, of course, bought up many of the Spanish language radio stations, a lot of other things like that. You have them react to the grassroots. When the media react to it, the media articles then inform the public officials. And between the grassroots and the media, you can basically cause government reactions. When you have government reactions, the media covers it again. And the support from the top, the media and the government, are then used to fuel more of a grassroots movement. And so what began as a small group of heavily financed individuals then expands by getting legitimate grassroots, hey, I believe in this issue, people involved. And that's how you create a mass movement in a society. Using these three tiers, you can puppeteer change within a society. And I believe that's what he's being accused of doing. In fact, I would note that he's even said some of this openly, and he's even done this in other countries, by the way. Donald Trump is now suggesting that could be a violation of the law. Is that the case? It'll be a wild court case if it is. I don't know which way it would go, because it's hard to argue that you're intentionally doing that. But it'll be a wild time if they ever do bring charges. One more point I would make on that. Normally, if you're investigating somebody on something so serious, you don't want to tell them about it. The fact that he's telling them we're watching you suggests that it's more a stand-down order than, hey, we're going to bring charges against you order, or it means an investigation is already underway and they're about to bring charges and it's already past the investigative stage. We don't know. We will probably see, but as of now, we don't know. Now, also on the point of far-left extremism, though, apparently Antifa, right, anti-fascist action, or in the old Germany, anti-fascisti action, it's becoming more extreme, to the point of even more serious violence. New York Post actually said this. They say experts who track domestic terrorism and extremist movements are not surprised. Once the face of a grassroots left-wing insurgency, Antifa has lost its spark. But experts warn that could be a dangerous thing, as the vacuum has given way to even more fringe and violent offshoots that are coalescing into the Marxist ether. And they add, we're only beginning to see the deadly fallout. Last month, Benjamin Song, a member of the Antifa militant group Elm Fork John Brown Gun Club and the Socialist Rifle Association, led a group of 10 radicals, 8 of whom were found living in a reportedly squalid transgender community in an armed ambush at an ICE detention center in Alvarado, Texas. The shooting left one officer injured. They allegedly had plans to kill police officers, and they actually did shoot one of them, by the way. Further on, they state this. An even more gruesome story unfolded with the February arrest of Jack Ziz Lasota, head of a murderous transgender cult accused of a multi-state killing spree that took 6 lives. The so-called Zizians espoused an ideology of anarchism and extreme veganism, seeking to slaughter figures of petty authority, quote-unquote, cops say. Notably, for some reason, a lot of the Antifa movement has been merged with a very, very radical and very violent transsexual movement as well. Some call it trans-Tifa. Again, a group of Antifa who are transsexuals and oftentimes advocate for violence openly. They talk about using violence as a way to defend their trans rights. So Antifa has very largely merged into that. And notably, the last two violent incidents I've noted, 6 people killed in one incident, 1 officer shot in the neck, actually another one. Those involve these types of Antifa. And further in, they state this. They say it usually goes like this. Stragglers and lost souls latch onto a charismatic elder in the movement, someone with nothing else going on in life but the communist hustle. And new factions are forged under the general anti-fascist umbrella. It's according to Gabriel Nadales, a 31-year-old former Antifa member. And they say they have names like Smash Racism, Redneck Revolt, and Refuse Fascism. Some would argue not representing any of the things they claim to represent because they're kind of fascist, right? And they note it should be noted that those particular groups are not accused of murder or fatal violence, but they do note that they are kind of part of the Antifa diaspora. Basically, what's happening is this. It seems that Antifa, which was a group of kind of radical anarcho-communists, right? Which have actually always been merged, even though you think they oppose each other. That very radical group that believed in using violence as a way to shut down conservatives, going back to Trump's first term in office and before. They would oftentimes, organize protests and violent beatings of conservatives anytime conservatives held a get-together or a speaking event or anything, or a protest, right? That movement has become more radical. As they became more radical, some of the less radical individuals left the movements. And as the less radical people left, the ones who do not believe in extreme use of violence, the remainders of them are the more extreme types. And that's becoming concerning because what happens? If the remaining people are the ones who believe in extreme use of violence, murder, killing of police officers, you name it, then that movement, which has been allowed to persist in the United States for a very long time for some reason, because Antifa was even protected during some incidents, where the people who fought against them were arrested, but the Antifa members were not. The very loose-handed response to Antifa for many years has allowed this radical organization, which openly advocates violence as a form of political change, which, by the way, is the definition of terrorism, they've been allowed to continue like this with almost very little consequence for a long time. Some now, but for a long time, very little consequence. As they become more extreme, the organizations that were part of its networks are turning into individual movements. And as that's happening, well, we're seeing what's happening now, which is they're kind of becoming terrorists. I mean, in the very real, very open sense. They're becoming a lot more extreme. And even more than that, the ideology they espouse, the use of violence to defend their movements, the use of murder, the need to kill fascists, quote unquote, and they use the term fascist for basically everybody who's not a communist, like not even like conservatives. They label even like the normal left, they would label as their enemies. And because they espouse the use of violence, some of them are getting radicalized even by the narratives. And look, speaking of this whole violent extremist movements, there was another mass shooting, another one. And this individual targeted a Catholic church, shooting through the stained glass windows. The suspect does appear to be a transsexual man, and he seems to have been radicalized against Christians. And I mean, to be frank, kind of hated everybody. He had writings that are now being shown. They deleted it, but people saved archives of it. He had writings against Jews. He had writings against black people. He had writings against, a lot against Christians. He seemed to have a deep hatred for, it seems like most people, actually. The post-millennial said this: They say the suspected shooter who killed 2 children and injured 17, couple still on very critical condition still, hopefully they'll recover. And it says other people at a Minneapolis Catholic church on Wednesday morning has been identified as Robin Westman, per reporter Carol Markowitz. Robin was his changed name. His original name was Robert because, I guess you can register as trans. He had his name changed in line with his new identity. It notes that reports indicate the suspect may have been transgender. A since-deleted YouTube account under the username Robin W. posted numerous videos in the hours leading up to the shooting. In one video, the user showed off a gun that had writing on it, including the phrases, quote, "Where is your God?" quote, "Kill Donald Trump," and quote, "I'm the woker, baby, why so serious?" It seems to be a reference to the Joker from Batman, Why So Serious, but he said woker instead of Joker. And other phrases including, quote, "Burn Israel," and, quote, "6 million was not enough," a reference, we assume, to the Holocaust, right? In the same video, it notes the user shot at a target that had a picture of Jesus on it. He had a photograph or drawing of Jesus's face at the head of a gun target. And it had with it, quote, "He came to pay a debt he didn't owe because we owe a debt we cannot pay," typed out underneath Jesus. Something was deeply wrong with this individual. This guy had some real issues. Now, the narrative on this is going to change heavily depending on which media you're going to read. I found it interesting. The account for Occupy Democrats is basically saying this guy was a quote-unquote white national, and they're claiming he was a white national because, he had writings saying that he hated black people, and he had writings, again, as you saw, against Jews. He seemed to hate the normal targeted groups of like the Nazi far right, right? Like the actual Nazis. He does have views in line with them, but he also has views on the other side of transsexual activism, hating conservatives, hating Christians, hating Donald Trump. So how do you make sense of it? Where he kind of seems to align with the extremes on both sides and kind of hates everybody in between, frankly. Now, most of the conservative news outlets are focusing on the man's transsexual identity, his anti-Trump messages, his obvious hatred of Christians, his now deleted YouTube videos where he espoused some of the stuff. I'm not going to show you the guy's stuff. It's disgusting. There was something wrong with him, right? Now, news outlets are arguing on both sides of this. How do you deal with it? On the left, you have the normal narratives. The problem is the guns. How does somebody who's obviously really perturbed get firearms? He had, of course, an AR-15, style weapon. I say that, right? He had a shotgun, and he also had a pistol, and a large number of magazines, which he wrote political statements in all of them. He seemed to align very, very heavily with the kind of left-wing media establishment narratives on Ukraine, on Israel, and everything else, where he seems to align with the idea that we gotta fight for Ukraine, and we gotta that Israel's the bad guys and Gaza. He seemed to have these ideas. He also seemed to believe that Christians are the cause of the suffering of transsexuals because their values suggest that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing, frankly. And so again, on the left side of the political spectrum, you're watching a lot of narratives. How does a crazy guy like this get firearms? We need gun control. This happened in Governor Tim Walz's area. Tim Walz notably was actually asked by the Catholic community for more protection. Rather than do that, he kind of went the other way. He gave a lot more support to the trans community and so on. And he's being criticized for that now. Is it his fault? I don't think so, to be honest. On the right side of the political spectrum, people are saying this guy was obviously radicalized. Who radicalized him? He had a very, very extreme hatred of Christians. And look, even though you can say he hated a lot of people, the people he shot at The kids he killed, they were Catholics, right? And so you might argue that, yeah, he had like anti-black and anti-Jew statements and all. I mean, he kind of hated a lot of people. He shot Christians, okay? Absolutely disgusting stuff. Really horrible, horrible tragedy, terrible things. It's always terrible when these things happen. And, you know, of course, the normal argument in society is, well, what do we do about it, right? What do we do about it? On one side of the spectrum, they say the answer is to get rid of guns. Others say, look, getting rid of guns hasn't helped countries that got rid of guns. You have in France where when people don't have guns, they get a truck and drive it through a crowd, and they kill more people than this, by the way. In China, you have mass stabbing incidents where people go to like daycares and murder a bunch of kids. Same thing in the United Kingdom. You can't even walk around with a pair of like pruning shears there, and you have crazy people killing kids with knives. More kids than this, by the way. I'm not saying one is worse than the other. But my point is, they're arguing that that doesn't solve the problem. On the other side of it, people are saying that maybe this is being caused by something else. Maybe it's the drugs they're giving these people. If you're giving hormone treatments, are you giving these people, you know, what we used to call roid rage? You're giving people steroids. You're giving them like, you know, things that mess with their hormones. And if you are messing with someone's hormones, it affects your emotions. It affects your mental state. Everybody's experienced this probably when you were like 12 or 13 years old and you go into that crazy hormonal time in your life. It messes with your head. If you're giving people hormones that go against the natural state of their bodies, are you messing with their heads? A fair question to ask. Others are raising question against SSRI antidepressants, which is, by the way, a common factor among a lot of these crazy school shooters we've seen. A lot of them do take these drugs. And there are people who were on them prior who've come out and noted and stated publicly that when they were on them, they did things without realizing they were doing it. Paranoid, schizophrenic type, you know, symptoms. And, you know, they're living in this horrible environment. And when you can't hard quit it, but when they wean themselves off, suddenly they kind of wake up and like, oh my gosh, I think it was that was doing it to me. The hard truth is we don't know the cause. The hard truth is we don't know. And I would say this, sometimes people are just crazy. Sometimes people are just frankly evil. And you don't always have to dig into the psychology of a crazy person. This person, based on their writings, was filled with hatred. This was a person who allowed hatred to just completely overtake their heart, frankly. It's very clear in the individual's writings. This was a person who was filled with hate, frankly. And you know, maybe that's part of what we need to reflect on as a society. Have we all allowed ourselves to be too affected by opposition, frankly, where we do stop seeing the humanity in the people who are different from us, right? On that point as well, I would say this is part of a growing trend, though, and something that is concerning, especially if you see these radical groups like Antifa and so on advocating for this type of violence. There are people advocating very openly for violence against Christians, conservatives, a lot of it coming from the more radical branches of the trans community. I'm not saying it's every single trans person is like this. If you look at the charts, you're like talking about 7% of the population now identifies with that. It's not all of them. You can disagree with their lifestyles, but it's not all of them. But I do think that there is a very radical movement starting up with very radical narratives that are advocating for this type of violence. And maybe that is something we also need to look at. Terrible tragedy. Really, my heart goes out to the families. It's easy to talk about. I would be devastated. So I'm not one to talk, right? Like, I can only imagine what they're going through. Look, another topic, though, the Trump administration is challenging foreign censorship laws, saying they're impacting American companies and Americans' free speech. Some of these laws are coming from Europe, and we could actually see travel bans against this. I'll be talking more about this after a quick break.
All right, just a pause here for a super quick moment. You are, of course, watching Crossroads with Joshua Philipp. I'm just here to share a message about American Hartford Gold, my own personal gold and silver bullion dealer. Now, obviously, the recent tariffs have made the markets super turbulent and volatile. With every new piece of tariff news, the markets seem to either crash up or crash down. And of course, it's worth mentioning that these conditions don't only affect Wall Street. They affect all of us through our investments and our retirement accounts. That's why I'd like to introduce you to a company that I trust and I myself use to secure my own savings, American Hartford Gold. They specialize in helping Americans move our assets into something tangible, into something you can actually hold, which is physical gold and physical silver, two precious metals that act as a hedge against all those decisions being made in Washington, D.C. They have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews, and they make the whole buying process super simple. Your metals can be shipped directly to your door, or you can transfer your current retirement account to a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And the best part is that right now, American Hartford Gold is offering an exclusive offer. When you call them today and you mention the name Joshua, you could receive up to $15,000 in free silver with your initial investment. Take advantage of their special offer. You can either just call them at 877-260-2764 or text Joshua to 65532. All their information will also be down in the description box below. And now, back to Crossroads.
Welcome back to Crossroads, a show by the Epoch Times, one of America's largest independent newspapers. Support us and independent journalism by hitting that like button, leaving a comment below, and thank you so much for watching. Now, on another topic, the Trump administration is challenging foreign censorship laws that are actually impacting American companies. They're fining us, they're forcing companies to censor us, including right here in the United States. Excuse me. Now, some of these companies are actually based out of Europe, and the Trump administration is saying they may even put travel bans on the European Union officials behind these policies. Now, Zero Hedge says this. They say President Donald Trump is weighing a travel ban on European Union officials behind the bloc's Digital Services Act, the DSA, a sweeping online regulation that the White House claims is designed to censor Americans. They say, according to sources familiar with the matter cited by Reuters, the State Department is considering visa restrictions targeting senior EU policymakers responsible for the legislation. They're saying as well, a decision hasn't been made, but the discussions inside the administration intensified after a high-level meeting last week. The move would directly punish foreign officials for domestic policies Washington says undermine U.S. free speech rights. Because there are foreign countries forcing censorship within the United States, suing websites, fining websites, going against providers, saying, how dare you allow speech that is illegal in their country, even though it's not illegal here. And some of these companies have said, what are you talking about? You're suing me, you're charging me, you're fining me. I'm based in the United States. My servers are in the United States. My business is in the United States. My clients are in the United States. If your citizens are accessing it, that's your problem, not mine. But of course, the European Union is targeting these companies. The Trump administration is now saying they cannot do that. Now, here it says the EU's DSA aims to compel tech giants to crack down on illegal content. Not illegal in the United States, but illegal in the European Union. And they say the Trump administration argues the policy amounts to government-driven censorship, according to Brussels, of forcing U.S. companies to muzzle American users under the guise of combating quote-unquote misinformation. A big move, by the way, because this raises the question over the kind of globalized nature of the internet itself and the globalized nature of modern business. If businesses are operating around the world, if the internet is accessible around the world, and, of course, even registered in the United States, does that mean, because they're accessible all around the world, that every single country in the world can hold them according to their laws, which means Americans have to abide by foreign laws? Does that mean that when we talk about stories, I would have to censor myself in accordance with every other country on earth because, we're talking over something that is accessible in every country on earth, the internet? It also raises the kind of further out question of what that means for freedom and what it means for society. It would effectively mean that the lowest common denominator, the most tyrannical countries on earth, would become the baseline of your freedoms. It would mean that if some random country, and who knows where, were to say that, hey, your free speech violates the laws of our country, does that mean Americans have to abide by their free speech laws or anti-free speech laws? Now, we could argue that currently the argument is between the United States and the European Union. The European Union is not as extreme as some countries, right? This isn't like the Chinese Communist Party, although they do force censorship here as well. Look at the NBA, look at Hollywood, look at a lot of, frankly, the big corporate media, which does censor to an extent based on the CCP's demands. In other words, it's already happening somewhat. But should we have to censor in accordance with their laws? The Trump administration is saying, no, this is not the case. How dare you try to censor Americans? We're not living in your country, we're living in ours, and we live under our laws, not your laws. We will see where this goes. This is part of a broader movement right now where on many tiers, the Trump administration is having dialogues with European Union leaders and United Kingdom officials in the UK, of course, talking about freedom of speech in Europe. May the best country win, let's say. Now, like also speaking of other countries, the Trump administration is also now encouraging people from other countries who are here in the United States illegally to go home. And they're giving an extra incentive, not by through an interesting means. They're threatening them with massive fines if they refuse to go home. Wall Street Journal says this: the Trump administration has issued $6.1 billion in fines to immigrants, they mean illegal aliens, it says have ignored deportation orders. They say now it is moving to collect those penalties. In recent weeks, the government has threatened immigrants. By that, they mean illegal aliens. This does not apply to normal immigrants, which means you're here legally. These are only people who are here illegally, not immigrants who would be fine to stay. But they're threatening illegal aliens with, quote, lawsuits, debt collectors, and ruinous tax bills if they don't pay financial penalties. They say if the recipient self-deports, Homeland Security says the fine will be waived, and they'll also receive a $1,000 exit bonus. Your departure bonus, $1,000. A little, maybe not a golden parachute, but not a financial debt parachute, right? $1,000 to sail away with. They said that since President Trump's return to office, the Department of Homeland Security has issued 21,500 fines to people to persuade people in the backlogged immigration court system to leave the U.S. And notes the penalties come as the department struggles to fulfill Trump's promise for the largest deportation campaign in U.S. history. Now, on that point, 21,500 people facing fines of close to $1,000 every single day that they decide to not self-deport. That's a lot of money. Over 21,000, over $6 billion. Them's are rookie numbers because what they're talking about in reality are closer to 10 or 20 million people. And if you think 10 or 20 million people rather than 21,000, that's going to be a lot more money. That's a lot of money. Let's put it this way. If 21 million represents $6.1 billion, what is 10 million going to represent, or even more than that? It's interesting, the Trump administration, they're using a bit of financial pressure to push people out the door, let's say. I do think it's likely we're going to see this trend continue. I think right now they're testing the waters on it. They're just going after a handful of people, seeing how it works. I would say if people can eliminate these massive threats of fines by just leaving the country, this will probably push a lot of people to self-deport. I do think this is going to be a working system because, you know, for a lot of people who are choosing to stay here, they're kind of hedging their bets. They're saying, you know, look, I know that Trump wants to deport me. Maybe the next U.S. president will not. Maybe they'll say, hey, you can stay. Maybe we'll even give you American citizenship, because that's kind of been the carrot dangling at the end of the stick that these people have been kind of lured with for a very long time. They've been fed mixed narratives. And you could argue they're at fault for coming here illegally. You could also argue we're at fault for telling them it's okay for so long. Which side do you want to believe? But the other side is, if your ability to comfortably live here while waiting for the next 3, 4, maybe 8 years, maybe 12 years even, maybe never getting an end to it. And in the meantime, you're faced with hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in fines. Some are facing over $1 million in fines. Debt collectors, everything, maybe even taking away your property, seizing your private property in some cases. Is it better for you to eliminate that debt, take $1,000 and go back to your own country? The country, and again, some of these people have been here like 10, 20 years, so they don't have anything built up there either. But they might say, you know what, starting from page 1 with nothing to my name is better than living here with, negative $1 million to my name. We will see. I do think this is meant to incentivize people to self-deport, and it does seem to be that that's what's happening. That said, everybody, questions, comments, anything you want to talk about, leave it in the chat. Let's jump into a discussion. All right, a couple questions here. Let's see. California gal, you're saying, Josh, say if you look at Berlin, you can see how stark the architecture on the east side was, where communism was. Yeah, you're talking about kind of the, feels like a long time ago. We're talking about the Cracker Barrel redesign and the stripping away of character we've been watching. You know what's really interesting is I've seen a lot of comments from people who grew up in communist countries comparing the corporate rebrandings in the United States to the anti-traditionalist movements that we saw under the Soviet Union and under the Chinese Communist Party. It's an interesting comparison because, in the US, it's not like you have some crazy communist party ordering its little red guards to go and smash the old architecture and buildings like you had in those countries. It's being done instead by marketing executives, some of whom, including some of the ones we're talking about, were from the DEI background, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It raises the fair question of, are these people motivated by an anti-traditionalist communist agenda? Some would say they are. And even though they're not doing it through the same types of narratives the Chinese Communist Party, the Soviets might have been doing, is it the exact same thing, just through a more polished means? Maybe it is. People that point, Trump, for example, remember during his first term in office, he was talking about the beautification of federal buildings. That was an interesting movement. They were talking about the kind of brutalist type architecture that has taken over federal buildings. Brutalism is this kind of nasty, concrete steel look. You remove all the fine art. You remove all the fine details of traditional architecture. A lot of American traditional architecture was actually modeled after Rome. The founding fathers, in the creation of federal buildings, we modeled our society, our government, our military, our structure of government, our political system, a republic, by the way, and our architecture and a lot of our art after the Roman Empire. And, it's interesting a brief side note on this. I do think that the American fascination with Rome and does anybody remember that trend where girls, women were asking their boyfriends or husbands, how often do you think about Rome? And the guys were like, every day, once a week. It turns out that's not like men in every part of the world. For some reason, American men frequently think about Rome. I often think about Rome. I think about Rome at least once every couple days. I often think, maybe even more than that. I probably think about Rome every day, right? But I think the reason for that is because American society is modeled after the Roman Empire. It is. The structure of our military, the organization of our military, some of the trainings, the shaved, the crew cuts you have, the shaved heads, it's all modeled after the Roman legion. Our political system, the Republican system of government, we are a republic, not a democracy, is modeled after Rome. And of course, the architecture is modeled after Rome. And, some people want the American architecture to remain in that image. The more modernist way is stripping that. They're redoing buildings because they say it's cheaper to maintain or whatever else. I'd argue maybe not, because some of these buildings cost like $3-4 billion. That ain't cheap. But again, that's the idea with it. Now, on the point of, kind of the cultural narratives of pulling up the culture, is this a communist movement, right? Fair question to be asking. I do think it's a fair argument, it might be, because communism, when it carries out cultural destruction, look, under the Soviet Union they did this, under the Chinese Communist Party they had the Cultural Revolution, which openly advocated for destroying the four olds. Old ideas, old art, old beliefs, old architecture. They destroyed the temples and the churches and the monuments and the statues and everything. Destroying not only the history, but even the memory of the history of what the people of China were. Horrible destruction. Is America undergoing the same thing? I have many Chinese friends who've argued, yeah, and they're concerned about it. Some of my friends who I've talked to who grew up in China have been saying, look, America is undergoing a cultural revolution. And they point to the anti-American education being promoted in schools. They point to the revisionist history that demonizes the Founding Fathers. They point to the way that media and different organizations are demonizing the American identity, demonizing the values that we stand for, rewriting some of those values, falsifying history in some cases. The history of Christopher Columbus has been falsified. Howard Zinn, a communist, by the way, redid a lot of that. The way the 1619 Project by the New York Times, notably false history according to their own fact checker, but they published it anyways, was used to even rewrite American textbooks being taught to your children. The advocacy of hatred, what you see in museums, promoting only a negative image of our country, the American identity. There has, whether you believe this is intentional or not from like a communist perspective, there has in fact been a revision of American history, American identity, and American culture, which is being done out of a hatred for what America is. And is that being reflected as well within businesses? Maybe. Maybe. I would add that the modernist, brutalist architecture, and I'm not to say everything is communism, but that was also rooted in communism. The people who started those movements were also doing it for a communist agenda, and that is the truth of it. A lot of modern art actually comes from that as well. And so I do think that the comparison is fair. Those dang commies trying to remake our nostalgic brands, folks. That's what's going on. Martin McKenzie, you're saying, why do so many Americans scoff at communism as if it was a past joke? Yeah, some do and some don't. I mean, maybe they're not watching this show enough. That's the solution. You got to tell them to come and watch Crossroads. That is the real cure to communism. They got to come and hang out with us. Right? They got to come sit in our chat and hang out with all of you. And that's the real cure to communism. Right? On that note, too, I mean, look, on a serious note, look, I like to be tongue-in-cheek. I like to joke around a bit. But, communism, it actually is pretty serious. Look, in the real sense, this is the most murderous ideology in human history. And I'm not exaggerating. You're talking 1 million to 150 million people killed under communism. You're talking about something that tried to destroy the faith, the tradition, and the values of every single country it has ever touched. You're talking about, look, we can talk about the minimized picture of violence. When you look at one person being murdered, one person being raped, it's horrible. When you talk about 100 million people being brutalized, tortured, raped, killed, it's hard to put a personalized face to it because it's overwhelming. It is the unfortunate nature of mass movements like this that cause such incredible amounts of harm. That it kind of I don't know why we're like this as people, but there's something that desensitizes us to the personal experience of torment and violence when the numbers are just too high. Imagine that every single person killed in that way, died in the same way as, these kids who were just killed at this Catholic church, shot, grieving families, people pouring their hearts out to it. Every person who was killed is no different than that girl in the Netherlands, raped, murdered. We can all agree that was horrible, absolutely horrible. But when you're talking not about one person, but about 100 million people or 150 million people, it gets overwhelming a bit, right? And so I do think that, look, we can all agree the Nazis were bad. I think we can all agree that, the killing of, 6 million, I know the numbers varied, because they don't really know the full numbers. They say 6 million, maybe it's even more, who knows, right? We can all agree that was horrible. Why can't we also acknowledge that the entire communist movement, which killed many more than that, was also horrible? I do think eventually, as societies, as a world, we need to have a similar movement that happened with the denazification movement, the Nuremberg trials. We need to have the equivalent of that with communism. One day, communism needs to be put on trial. And through that, we need to make the name of communism just as disgusting, just as culturally reprehensible as Nazism. Until that day comes, you're going to have kids who don't understand it. Until that day comes, you're going to have kids being raised through our education system who identify with it and who say, hey, let's give it another shot. Until that day comes, until our culture fully rejects it, and until people are fully educated over what it actually does represent, it's going to keep being there. And until that day comes, we're going to face the ongoing threat of a murderous, what I would call openly satanic, absolutely disgusting system that has been one of the greatest causes of human misery that our societies have ever witnessed in all recorded history. May communism eventually come to an end. I think it has to happen. Judy Akeem, you're saying the issue with those leaning left is they put the empathy before the order of law and want to change how people are kept safe instead of stopping crime and actually helping others on the border of insanity. Yeah, I know some people call it, they call it suicidal empathy. I don't think I try to hide my, my opinions. But in the real sense, I think an extreme in either direction is not good. I think conservatism, I've said this before, I think it represents strictness. It represents a very rigid adherence to a moral standard. But I think you also have to have leniency. Leniency is not modern liberalism, but classical liberalism. Leniency is, hey, I do me, you do you. Don't tell me what to do. I respect your freedom so I can have my freedom. And that mutual tolerance allows us to have, I can have my beliefs even if they're different from yours. You're not going to try to throw me in the gulag for believing something different because you tolerate me like I tolerate you. When you have an overabundance of liberalism, you do have kind of an upside down system when it goes to an extreme, right? Because the absolute of liberalism would be absolute acceptance. And when you have absolute acceptance, what becomes evil is not moral decay. What becomes evil is saying you disagree with moral decay. And so when you have individuals like this who become really mentally disturbed, the extreme of that is they say what is evil is not this individual who's shooting targets with Jesus's face on it and saying he wants to kill Christians. What's evil is if you criticize that individual for his moral choices. That is the extreme. That's when you take it to the furthest extreme, right? Absolute acceptance. In other words, it represents a flipping upside down of good and evil. Evil is not the committing of evil. Evil is criticizing the choice of somebody who chooses evil. That's the absolute of that when you go to an extreme. On the other side, the absolute of extremism on the conservative side, which does exist, is over-strictness. You could actually say that radical Islam, right, terrorism represents an overabundance of strictness. hey, you believe in something I don't like, I'm going to throw you off a building or stone you to death. How dare you not cover your legs? We're going to put you in a pit buried up to your neck and the whole town's going to go throw rocks at you because we disagree with your looseness. You know what I mean? An overabundance of strictness can be just as bad, frankly. I don't think the extreme on the other side is good. I'm very much a classicist, I guess you could say, when it comes to taking the middle way. I believe the proper character. I shouldn't say. I believe the most harmonious and most solid way to take is the middle way, because it represents a leniency towards others, but an internal strictness. And I think actually the best way to encourage morality is not by forcing people into it, but by being a good example. I'm not saying I'm perfect, like by no means. I have plenty of shortcomings. As a religious person, I work on my shortcomings. I don't just, I'm not satisfied with being flawed. And if you were to ask me, I believe that's what, in my interpretation, I believe that's part of what being a religious person is. It's you recognize that you're flawed and you want to become better, right? The person who says, I am a sinner, and you want to change that, not that you just say, I want to stay that way. You want to become a better person. You want to become a more pure person because you view moral purity as representing a type of closeness with God. My interpretation of religion is that, right? And again, that doesn't mean I'm perfect. I'd say on the opposite side of it, those who pretend to be perfect are sometimes the worst, actually. Really. And sometimes the meanest. Sometimes they're really mean people, actually. There's the problem where you have people who become, overly zealous, who put on a facade of purity, who are some of the most evil people you'll ever meet. Just as bad, I think, is the extreme on the other side of people who just fully embrace evil. I'd put them on the same spectrum, to be honest. And so I do believe in the old-fashioned middle way. I'm strict with myself. I hold myself to very high standards, but I'm not going to hate a person just because their values are different from mine. And I do believe that showing kindness to people, even when you disagree with their moral choices, being kind to people even when they're not kind to you, I believe that is where morality shows itself. I don't believe kindness and compassion should only be reserved for people who are nice to you. In fact, I believe that kindness and compassion only demonstrate themselves when you're being treated in a way that's unfair and when you continue to be kind to people regardless of that. It's easy to be nice when they're nice to you, right? It's not easy when it's the opposite. And again, I'm not saying I'm perfect on this. I get annoyed by people too. I get irritated just like everybody else does, but I work on it. You know what I mean? I try to change that because that's what my values are. I'll give one last note because, I do read the comments even while I'm doing the show, and I was talking about these school shootings. Let me give you my take on this stuff. Because, you have all kinds of narratives, and I see what people are talking about. The narrative on the left is the problem is the tool. The problem is the guns. The narrative on the right, the problem is the stuff who make these people crazy. It's the drugs, it's the ideology, it's the radicalization. Maybe it's a combination of both. I'm going to give you a third perspective, my perspective. Let me tell you a story. So, so there's a very famous court case, Leopold versus Loeb. I can't remember the date of it. I think it was like early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. I can't remember which. You can look it up. It's a very famous court case. Basically, you had two kids who were geniuses, like really smart, rich white kids, came from very good backgrounds, extremely intelligent, right? Had the whole world given to them. And these kids wanted to commit the perfect crime. And what they did was horrifying. They went to school, they abducted one of the kid's little cousin, little kid after school, pick him up, hey, let's drive you home. On the drive, one of them beat him and killed him in the car. They then raped his corpse. Very terrifying, horrifying behavior. They then dumped his body in the woods. I believe they poured lye over his body or lime to decompose it. And they believed they could get away with it. To make a long story short, they were caught because one of the kids had a very rare prescription for glasses, and he dropped his glasses. Maybe that was divine intervention, right? Dropped his glasses, and obviously because he had a very unique prescription for his lenses, they were able to trace it back to him. So these kids stand trial. And the argument, I mean, it was a wild trial. You had the KKK saying, we're going to kill those kids if you let them go. It was a heated time in American society. People were mad. They were furious that these kids murdered another kid, which may be one of the first cases of school violence in America. And it started a real interesting debate in American society. The religious debate was the interesting debate. The question was this: how is it that two kids who are geniuses, who are wealthy, who have no problems in life, this was not caused by a lack of money, this was not caused by a lack of quality life, this was not caused by a lack of quality parenting, this was caused by something else. What was it? The religious argument at the time was this: what caused this was the fact these kids' heads have been filled with the idea that there is no God, there's no religion. They were saying, because this was at a time in American society where atheism was being taught in schools, frankly. And look, hear me out, because I'm not trying to throw atheists under the bus. I have friends who are atheists. They're not murdering their cousins, right? Like they're fine. Some of them are fine people too. I'm not throwing them under the bus, but hear me out. This was the argument. They were saying that if people do not believe in God, why should you care about good and evil? Who cares? If there is no God, what is right and what is wrong? If there's no God, why should you care on whether you die today or die tomorrow? Why should you care about whether you kill someone or not? There's no consequence. Sin doesn't exist. Karma doesn't exist. If that's what you believe, why would you care to not commit evil? And the argument was, this is what you're teaching our kids in schools. By teaching kids in schools atheistic, ideology, evolution and everything else, this is what you're telling them. You're telling them morality does not exist, frankly. And if you're telling people morality doesn't exist, why an educated kid did very well in school, why would they care? It's a fair question to ask. Have we been taught that morality does not exist? Have people been taught that? And I'd say even worse, have we been taught that there's a type of social morality? Because what happens with people always believe in some type of morality. A lot of the early communists, like the Paris Commune and the Jacobins and everything like that, a lot of them believe that human reason would be able to replace religious concepts of good and evil, that the Enlightenment, that we've moved beyond the need of a belief in heaven and hell and a belief in sin, right? They had this idea that philosophy could replace a moral foundation, or that it could work as a moral foundation. What they found was the opposite, though, that when people lift that anchor, that religion, and I'm not trying to preach one religion or another to any of you. I'm not trying to push any of that on you, all right? Believe what you want. But when you lift that anchor, your boat's going to drift. When you lift that anchor up, you're going to start forming your own type of concept of what is good and what is evil. Let's talk about the people these days. What is good and what is evil to them? Good for them is what they're doing. Good for them is what whatever the heck they want to believe. Good for them is transgender medication, this kid in particular, right? Transgender medication and believing in fighting the quote-unquote fascists who they've labeled as everybody else. Good for them is the fight against the people they deem to be the bad guys. Good for them is the belief that they should all be killed because they represent an ideology opposed to theirs. And evil for them is every value that says they're wrong. And in particular, in the case of the recent school shooting, evil for them was the Catholic community because they say that your morality says that my decisions are evil. That's what good and evil became for that person, right? That person was operating within an ideology of good and evil, but it was not an ideology of good and evil on a traditional moral anchor. It was what they had come to define as good and evil through their own, drifting boat, so to speak. I do think that, I know I'm going way over today. I do think that's the danger of not having some kind of traditional moral system. I'm not trying to preach to anybody one way or the other. I'm a very big fan of Stoicism. I'm a very big fan of ancient philosophies. I'm a very big fan of frankly most moral modern concepts. I've studied most religions actually. I've read a lot of religious books actually. But I do think there's a danger in when people try to abandon these things when they think they're above it, because you might be fine, because there is kind of a remnant of this, but your kids won't be. The next generation won't be. And as societies gradually give these things up, society will drift further and further and further away, until you end up with a society that is ill, a society that has developed a type of warped nature. And I'm not the first person to warn about this. Aristotle talked about this in his Ethics. I never know how to pronounce it, the Nicomachean Ethic or something like that. Aristotle's book, Ethics, fantastic book, one of my favorites. He talks about how societies develop a type of moral sickness. And this is pre-Christian writing, it's Aristotle. He talked about, the island of Cyprus and stuff like that. Cultures where morality for them was having a big party and eating their babies. I'm not joking, he actually gives these examples. That it is possible, and we've seen it through history, that as the moral boat drifts, people develop some pretty sick things. You can have entire cultures that become sick once they begin to drift. And I do think that's a danger. And I do feel that to an extent we're at risk of that right now. Even though I think our whole society is not doing that, you do have people who are. And I would argue part of that is because that's what they've been taught. Back to that case, Leopold versus Loeb. This is what kids have been taught. And look at what the kids like that are being taught now. The hatred of America, the hatred of conservatism, the hatred of Christians, transgender and sexual identity being the basis of morality. They've been taught the basis of morality is identity politics, right? And so if your basis of morality is identity politics, what's evil? Anything that opposes it. And so if you want to destroy evil, if you want to fight against evil, who is your enemy? People with traditional morality. And so that's the way I interpret this. When I look at these issues, that's what I'm looking at. And what's the solution to it? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if schools should preach religion. I don't want, because you could argue you like it. Everybody likes religion being taught in schools when it's your religion. If your kids are being taught another religion, you probably would not support it. But maybe we should have some basis to that. Maybe what is the option, right? Maybe we need some of that. Maybe there does need to at least be some kind of moral standard taught in schools, or at least a veneration of God, in schools. Maybe we do need that. I don't know. But I do think that what we're doing right now is not working, frankly. This anti-moral education is not working. And I think as kids are continually being taught an anti-tradition, anti-moral thing, you're manufacturing a social sickness that is going to spread if you don't stop it. So that's my stance on this stuff. Everyone, that said, it's Thursday, which means, of course, we won't have an episode tomorrow. We will have prime time. So if you want to watch prime time, join me tomorrow. That's going to be 7 o'clock. Is it 7 o'clock or 7:30? Eastern time. Great show, by the way. Next Monday is Labor Day. I will not be here. I don't mind doing the show on a holiday. The show is not just me. I have a video editor and producer, and I'm not going to make them work on a holiday, so we're not going to have a show on Monday. So again, we'll be back on Tuesday, next Tuesday. So have a great long weekend. Enjoy time with your families. In the meantime, everyone, thank you so much for being here. And as always, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.